Well, hello, everybody. My name's Rima McCoy Heighton. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm delighted that you have chosen to join me for this series that I'm calling Ahimsa, Dharma Talk for Black Lives. It's a three-part series, and if you give me a moment, I'm going to do a screen share here. There we are. Three-part series. Today, episode 1, fear and self-loathing. So in this particular episode, we're going to cover who I am, why I decided that pulling this series together would be a prudent thing to do. We're also going to talk about how fear manifests as white supremacy. So one of the big goals of this series is one of the big goals of why I do what I do is to have conversations about how white supremacy manifests in spaces that white people love to insist it doesn't inhabit. White people love to focus on white supremacy occurring with a high degree of regularity in right-wing conservative spaces in the South, et cetera, and love to think that liberal spaces or woke spaces, progressive spaces, spiritual spaces, yoga studios, whatever, that there's no white supremacy in these spaces, and there absolutely is. It manifests in a covert manner, and it is most definitely there, and I consider my vocation being uncovering and shining a great big floodlight on white supremacy in these types of spaces. And so this particular series is all about how white supremacy, whiteness, anti-Blackness shows up in woke spaces. We're also going to talk about how, ironically enough, paradoxically enough, self-loathing and white supremacy go hand in hand for white people. So, but first, a disclaimer. For those of you who've never experienced a talk or facilitation or training with me, I always begin anything that I do with the following disclaimer. This is a safe space. This is a pre-recorded series. I am not actually with you. I am not personally attacking anybody, but hit dogs do holler nevertheless. And safe and comfortable are rarely the same thing, particularly when we're talking about whiteness, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness in progressive type spaces. Discomfort, in fact, in the context of confronting anti-Blackness in these types of spaces is typically a sign that you are being pointed in the right direction. So, who I am. Again, my name is Rima McCoy Heighton. My pronouns are she and her. A brief visual description of myself for those of you listening along is as follows. I'm a Black woman, afforded the privileges of having light skin. I'm in my early 40s. I'm wearing tortoiseshell glasses. I have a great big head of brown hair, natural hair, and I'm seated in my home office with various pieces of artwork behind me, including to my right, a print from Mr. Jonathan Davis called Critical Race Theory, which features images of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Harriet Tubman being whitewashed by a white figure. Anyhow, I have a master's degree in nonprofit administration. I have 20 plus years of experience in managing nonprofit organizations, programs, et cetera, et cetera. Additionally, I'm a former Soto Zen Buddhist monk trainee. No kidding. Yes, I did 2 years in Mount Shasta Abbey in Mount Shasta, California. I did not become a monk, but Lord, was it a learning experience. I also have experience in the political realm. I am a former Working Family Party endorsed candidate for office in the state of Iowa. I have also worked with hundreds, if not thousands by this point, of folks in nonprofit, progressive, spiritual, other woke spaces on issues pertaining to racial inequity, anti-Blackness very specifically and very intentionally. And as an added bonus, and I love to throw this in just in case anybody listening is thinking, well, I have a disability or I'm queer or whatever, and so I can't have privilege. Well, I'm autistic and I'm gay. And so there you go. What to expect from this 3-part series. So short little bursts of episodes, no longer than 30 minutes, myriad opportunities to confront white supremacy using yogic, Buddhist, New Thought, and other so-called holistic practices. Also going to talk about how Western conceptualizing around Eastern philosophies pertaining to yoga, Buddhism, New Thought, and other holistic practices is in and of itself rooted in white supremacy, cultural appropriation, all that great stuff. A very specific and intentional focus on anti-Blackness. We're not going to be veering away and focusing on ableism or sexism or homophobia or whatever so that we can hide from what we're here to talk about, which is anti-Blackness. Some key concepts before we dive into the esoteric. What is esoteric? Esoteric is information that is mysterious, not easily revealed. Zen koans are an example of the esoteric, teaching life lessons using kind of abstract concepts and that kind of thing so that we can feel really smart and well put together intellectually speaking. New Thought is all about what's known as Christ consciousness Christianity, sort of like a new age blend of Christianity, kind of without the hell and brimstone and all that stuff, and more like God is love and is a beautiful energetic force that unites us all. Great. New Age. Typically, when we're talking about New Age in our society, we're talking about very westernized, Americanized manifestations of ancient Eastern philosophies, and we're going to get into that here in a few minutes. Yoga. It's about more than doing back bends and turning your body into a pretzel and that kind of thing. It's also about spiritual, mental, physical, yes, practices that are meant to facilitate union between self and the cosmos. Ahimsa, the word that is a part of the title for this series. Respect for living things, avoidance of violence, not just gunshot violence, but death by 1,000 paper cuts violence as well, which is really kind of the focus of this series. So, and then of course there's anti-Blackness. Well, what does that mean? What am I talking about when I talk about anti-Blackness? So I've got kind of a 5-step segue into what Rima means when Rima is talking about anti-Blackness. So anti-Blackness really, truly is the ordinary, the normal way that this society we live in conducts its affairs. It's the common everyday experience of most Black people in this country. Think about how Black people got to this country in the first place. Just because the Civil War ended and Black folks got emancipated, doesn't mean that all of that trauma and the epigenetic and inheriting of pain and misery just swoop, went away. It's still here. We're still operating in that system. It's become very covert, but nevertheless, it's still a form of violence, and it permeates every corner of the society that we live in. Anti-Blackness serves the interests of white people in power. So the billionaires, the politicians, the celebrities, blah, 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 benefits them materially, but it also benefits average, everyday, so-called quote unquote, working class white people psychically. Gives average, everyday white people somebody to look down upon, which really is invaluable in this oppressive system that we live in. And so neither group, very few white people feel any real incentive to push back or let alone fight anti-Blackness in our society. The weird thing is that a lot of what we're talking about is like unity in this series race and races are social and political constructs. There's very little biological imperative to perpetuating this idea of race. Nevertheless, it's a huge thing. It's commodity practically in the society that we live in. We've created these categories and society manipulates them when it's convenient. If you look up the history of whiteness and who gets to be white throughout US history, it's a very fascinating rabbit hole, really. In reality, our differences as human beings are actually quite minimal in comparison to what we have in common and have little or nothing to do with personality, intelligence, or morality, or even genetics. Nevertheless, society, being what society is, which is a system of oppression, chooses to ignore the things that unify us all and compels us to ignore them as well, and assigns characteristics to entire populations of people in order to advance this idea of race and anti-Blackness and the superiority of whiteness and who gets to be white. The goalposts move all the time, really. The power elite racialize different groups of folks at different times to achieve economic agenda, continually and repeatedly prioritizing profit over people. So that is just kind of scratching the surface of what anti-Blackness is. And so anti-Blackness ultimately results when uniformity or status quo is threatened. And if you're into yoga or spirituality or whatever, well, theoretically, you're all about unity. And so something to think about. And with that, let's begin. So inviting your fears in for tea. Let's talk about somebody named Milarepa. Milarepa was a Tibetan Siddha, or a mystic, and a yogi who lived from 1052 to 1135. Milarepa got their start in their early adulthood as a mass murderer. Had kind of a road to Damascus awakening along the way and became a Buddhist mystic. And it's said that at one point he literally invited his demons in for tea. So let's talk about that a little bit. I've got a passage here from the monk Pema Chodron from her book called Start Where You Are, A Guide to Compassionate Living. One evening, Milarepa returned to his cave after gathering firewood, only to find it filled with demons. They were cooking his food, reading his books, sleeping in his bed. They had taken over the joint. He knew about non-duality of self and other, but he still didn't quite know how to get these guys out of his cave. Even though he had the sense that they were just a projection of his own mind, all the unwanted parts of himself, he didn't know how to get rid of them. So first he taught them the Dharma. He sat on the seat that was higher than they were and said things to them about how we are all one. He talked about compassion and shunyata and how poison is medicine. Nothing happened. The demons were still there. Then he lost his patience, got angry and ran at them. They just laughed at him. Finally, he gave up and just sat down on the floor saying, I'm not going away and it looks like you're not either, so let's just live here together. At that point, all of them left except one. Milarepa said, oh, this one is particularly vicious. We all know that one. Sometimes we have lots of them like that. Sometimes we feel that's all we've got. He didn't know what to do, so he surrendered himself even further. He walked over, put himself right into the mouth of the demon and said, just eat me up if you want to. Then that demon left too. So why are we talking about Milarepa? What's going on here? What does Milarepa potentially teach us about facing white fragility? Let's talk about reframing fear as an invitation to actually see what we are trying so hard to push back, to avoid and push back against. Before we do that, some more key concepts so that we're operating with the shared understanding of the terms that are being used in this series. Implicit bias, attitudes and or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, decisions in an unconscious manner. Implicit bias is something that happens when our brain is on autopilot. Implicit bias is a universal experience for all human beings. Implicit bias is what compelled our ancient ancestors to run when wildebeests were stomping all over the land lest they be crushed underfoot. Fast forward to today, in the modern day and age, and that same mechanism that ensured our ancient ancestors' sustainability gets us into kind of twitchy situations. Think about the white lady who's on an elevator who holds her purse a little closer to her when a black guy gets on. That's implicit bias. Also super racist, anti-Black. There you go. White fragility, discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequity and injustice. Huge issue in spiritual liberal spaces, because people don't want to own the fact that sometimes you're not the change, sometimes you're the problem. It is what it is. White privilege, inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society that is characterized by racial inequity and injustice. And then intersectionality, this definition, for those of you who've participated in anything that I've done in the past, is going to sound a lot different, but I am returning to the original definition of intersectionality and am committed to not veering from it anymore. Intersectionality is about the experiences of marginalization specific to Black women, who are the most marginalized of all demographics in the United States. That is a fact that cannot be debated. If systems work to ensure that Black women are safe and supported, the outcome will be that all people will be safe and supported. And for those of you who are sitting there tripping because you're thinking, well, I'm white, but I have a disability, so I'm more marginalized than a Black woman, there you have it. There's implicit bias, a little bit of white fragility thrown in, because guess what? Black women can be disabled too. And so if a Black woman is sitting next to you and she has the exact same disability that you have an advantage over her because of your white skin. Intersectionality is about the experience of marginalization specific to Black women. If we commit to ensuring that all spaces are safe for Black women, and that includes the full spectrum of the experience of being a Black woman, which can include disability, diversity as far as gender identity, as far as sexual or romantic orientation, religious proclivity, et cetera, we are going to create a space that is inclusive of everybody. Now, back to Milarepa and white fragility. So, rejecting what you don't want to see, the demons causes suffering for you and limits. I don't see color is an immature and antisocial stance. It causes suffering, obviously, for people who are of color, but it also causes suffering for those of you who are hell-bent on not seeing color. That said, white privilege allows you to reject what you fear and even weaponize your fears. Think about the never-ending rash of white women calling the police on Black people for just living our lives. That is you weaponizing your fear. And that can actually be addicting. We'll talk more about that. Facing your fears can be an act of recovery. And more people are beginning to view their attachment to white supremacy and all of the spoils that it affords white people as an addiction. So some of you might be thinking, but this isn't about fear. This is about not allowing undesirable things into my vibration. Shut up. That's bullshit. It's a total misuse of spiritual tenets, and it's garbage. Don't do that. Speaking of that, law of attraction, law of allowing, you create your own reality, and other attempts at spiritual bypassing that white people try all the time. Oh. So for those of you who have tuned in and you don't know what law of attraction is, think back to 20 years ago or so when the book The Secret was just flying off the shelves. That's what we're talking about. So let's talk about how it made its way into Western society. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, several folks, and primarily in Great Britain and the US, became really enamored with what's known as Vedanta Advaita, which is ancient Hinduism, basically. It's the fundamental core of Hinduism. They also became enamored with Buddhism, Neoplatonism, which is named after the Egyptian philosopher Plotinus, who lived from 205 to 270. The Emerald Tablets, which are ancient Arabic texts that focus at length on alchemy, so turning base metals into gold, basically, transforming undesirable elements into desirable ones, and other non-Western modes of thought set to work to capitalize, make money on their largely profit-driven conceptualization of the above, and presto, the law of attraction was born. How the law of attraction gained footing in the US. I can't imagine how something like you can dream $1 million into your reality would not be anything less than an astonishing success in this highly capitalistic, materialistic society we live in. But here's how it gained a foothold. Through books, one written by Lillian James Allen, As a Man Thinketh. Another by William Walker Atkinson, Thought Vibration, or Law of Attraction in the Thought World. And then there was Thomas Troward's The Hidden Power, and other papers on mental science. A quote from the book: thought precedes physical form, and the action of mind plants that nucleus, which, if allowed to grow undisturbed, will eventually attract to itself all the conditions necessary for its manifestation in outward visible form. Most reported histories of the law of attraction do not delve into the pre-19th century, pre-white people history. Law of attraction, as we know it in the Western world, is completely whitewashed and monetized. It's bastardized. So, speaking of that, Western fallacies and misappropriations with regard to the New Age. We're all one. Don't invite anything or anyone into your vibration that causes you discomfort, especially angry Black women. Everything happens for a reason. What did you invite into your vibration that caused this to manifest in your life? Oh, you poor Black people. You just need to think better thoughts. It's all perfect. I don't see color because Black is unpleasant for me to look at. Bullshit. Spiritual bypassing is a cornerstone of New Age white supremacy and a way of glorifying one's own fear. It's an ugly truth, and I'm here to tell it. So let's pretend that the Buddha remanifested themselves into the modern world and redefined white supremacy according to the Buddhist tenets of the three poisons. White supremacy being greed, hatred, fear, and delusion. So let's say that white privilege is greed, anti-Blackness is hatred or fear, and white fragility is delusion. So white supremacy ultimately causes suffering. Buddhism is all about studying suffering and liberating oneself from suffering. Lots there with regards to really critically assessing one's relationship to attachments and that kind of thing. But ultimately, for the purposes of this conversation, when we're talking about suffering, we're talking about attachment to white supremacy, attachment to anti-Blackness, attachment to the spoils that whiteness brings to white people. White supremacy causes suffering for me as a Black person and misery for white people who are so attached to white supremacy. Case in point, got two white ladies on the screen here who became infamous a few years ago for calling the police on Black and other racially marginalized people who were simply living their lives. And both of these ladies are registered Democrats, by the way. All right. So as a Black person, a fair amount of white DNA in me, I did spend my first months of existence in utero inside the belly of a horrifically racist white lady. That's a whole other series of conversations, but I like to say that I have an insider's understanding of whiteness, white supremacy, and all that stuff. And so there was a day where I had kind of an epiphany, and I realized that white people don't just hate Black people, either literally, figuratively, either overtly or covertly. You actually hate yourselves, especially white ladies. Oh my gosh. So love, self or otherwise, and white supremacy cannot coexist. So if you're all attached and hung up on white supremacy, there's no love or light inside of you. It's a lie. And everybody can see it, especially you, whether or not you're willing to admit it. There's a paradoxical relationship between whiteness and low self-esteem. And I like to define it this way. If white privilege is real, then how come I'm not good at anything? So, the poison of white supremacy for white people. Because look, I know white people well enough to know that person like me could talk about how Black people are harmed by white supremacy until the end of time. But 99.44% of white people are not going to give a goddamn unless there's something articulated with regard to this is how this harms you, specifically, white person. Look, it is what it is. So let's talk about how white supremacy harms white people. It tells you that although you are a member of the most exalted race, you, nevertheless, aren't pretty, aren't talented, aren't qualified, and aren't good enough for anything. Nevertheless, it still extends a carrot in front of you that entices you to do, be, acquire more products, or land, accolades, whatever. And just when you think you're close to biting the carrot gets further extended and it leaves you totally exasperated, full of quiet desperation, and totally attached to like just gobbling up more and more and more and more. Nevertheless, that quiet desperation gets real loud when a racially marginalized person approaches and informs you that you have privileges not afforded to them. So, quote from Ms. Lila Watson, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberations are bound up with mine, then let us work together. Our liberty is bound together." A lot of folks that I work with in the nonprofit sector and spiritual spaces, whatever, they find themselves in these spaces because they want to be the change. They want to help people, that kind of thing. They want to operate from a pedestal, so to speak, and look down at all the little people and decide which ones are going to get helped and which ones are not going to get invited into their vibration. That's so gross. No one's going to get liberated with that mindset. We are all, as Ram Dass says, walking each other home, so to speak. In episode 2, we're going to talk about being impeccable with your word and believing Black people's words. So that's the end of this particular episode. I do thank you for your time, and I hope that you consider watching the other episodes in the series, Ahimsa, Dharma Talk for Black Lives. Thanks, everybody.